Welcome everyone to the Ship It podcast. After a little bit of a hiatus through the summer, we're back. Today we're going to be talking about single-page applications, why you need them, when you would reach for one, how did we get here using single-page applications the way we do. I'm Brandon Askov. I work at Rocket Insights as a software engineer and director of Webby Things. Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt Merrill. I'm a developer, mostly a back-end developer at Rocket Insights.
I'm Adam Frazier. I do front-end stuff and component libraries here.
And I'm Scott O'Brien. I'm also a developer, and I'm heavily in the user experience space.
All right, awesome. So that's our crew today. So real quick, I figured I would go through a history, or at least my version of a quick history of like how we got to making single-page applications the way we do today. So for me, I was in college at the time, and it was 2005, and Google Maps had just come out, and it was the first time where I could drag the map around on screen. Like, keep in mind at the time all we had was MapQuest, so this was not a thing. It was like click zoom or click to the right, and you have to wait for the whole page refresh and for the map to come back. So in this case, you could drag with a mouse hand, like just drag the map and it would reload on screen without refreshing the page. And I was like, whoa, mind blown. And that was what, became like, how did they do that? Oh, AJAX, the XML HTTP request thing. So that spawned off a whole bunch of work around jQuery and AJAX plugins and stuff that we used for a long time to kind of give that desktop-y feel, but in the browser window. Now, it's still not quite a single-page application because you would go to a different, like if I clicked into Gmail from Google Maps, it would still be a big page refresh. I'd get a new app, in that view, but and it would feel like a single-page app there. But so it was still a lot of server-based page refreshes at that time.
That's so funny that you mentioned that. I totally forgot MapQuest was static like that. In, I think, 2006, I was working in a research lab for visualization stuff, and we're doing a regional mapping tool. And the big thing was, are we going to do this with AJAX or Flex?
Oh, my God. Yeah. So that's great segue. I was going to say an honorable mention here goes to Flex for being out around the same time, which was the Flash equivalent of making single-page applications. I worked at Brightcove at the time, and they built their entire code based on Flex. So I'm familiar with it. It did not survive in much the way the Flash didn't. But that's sort of the overall vibe here, right? It was sort of like, how do we use web tech to deliver like a desktop app, right? So then fast forward some years later where we're all doing all this state management with jQuery and whatever kind of hacky solutions we have on the client. And then Angular comes out. And we see this demo where you type into an input field and it's just reflected in your state's, in your application's state. And we're like, holy cow, that solves so many problems. And we all jumped on that. And then, it's unfortunate that Angular's first because it kind of showed some of its problems right away, where it's like how many times you have to work around these scope digest issues and trying to understand this underlying concept, the magic that sat beneath Angular. So that way, I think when React came out, people jumped on board there because the learning curve was shorter and it was a little bit more modern and they had learned from Angular's faults. So that basically kind of brought us up to, then there were framework wars, framework fatigue, and now we've got Vue and Svelte 3 that's out. There's a whole bunch of things, but the point is we sort of arrived at getting Electron, which was getting your desktop app built with web technologies that feels it is a desktop app. It doesn't just feel like a desktop app. It is a desktop app. So we have that. And I feel like when we started in 2005 with this whole Google Maps thing, we were trying to eventually get to a point where we had a desktop app that we could build with web tech. And we have that now. But I feel like we just kept driving straight on past that mile marker. This thing's got rockets, right? Let's go off this cliff. And that's where I feel like we're at now. Where I don't necessarily know why we're still going down this path as aggressively as we all are as an industry. I will say, I should give a little bit of history, like why I feel valid talking about this. So I not only was programming during all that history, I lived through all that pain. I've seen this all happen and cycle before. So for me, getting to that Electron mile marker was the thing. And then we got there and it didn't seem like anyone cared.
You didn't get off the proverbial exit
or
whatever.
Exactly.
It's you stayed on the highway.
Totally. And I'm notorious for being a jack of all trades, but definitely go after the shiny things. And now for me, I'm I don't even care about Svelte 3. So that just goes to show that I'm burnt out. I've hit my jaded senior level burned outedness, and I'm just vanilla JavaScript. I don't actually feel that way. But the point is that I have many times taken that single page application as a hammer and now everything is a nail. And that's not necessarily the best way to solve these problems. We built a lot of, I should mention, at Rocket Insights, we build a lot of products. And the way I describe that to my family is things that you would have to log into. If you log into a bank, or you log into a Facebook, or you log into an app of any kind, that's the kind of stuff we build. sometimes that makes sense for a single page application, but sometimes it doesn't, and it's unnecessary. And I should also mention that it's expensive because it's modern, and you have to like hire modern developers to do that, and it's like a developer's marketplace right now.
But if your developers are really good at doing that, they might build it really quickly, right?
That's right.
I think, you become a hammer and it becomes the nail, but, hammers are pretty good at hitting nails and you do it often enough.
Yeah.
I think that's, sort of one side of this anyway.
Yeah, so that was the general history. I think that Flash was like a single page application every time you do one. It's one Swift you're loading up in the browser and you're using the whole application that way. So that was like the closest equivalent we had at the time, which is why I think Flex came out, because Flash was missing a markup language and a layout. You had to kind of do all your layout programmatically, which was fun for me. It was like solving little math problems all the time, like centering something on a screen as you resize a Swift. Like, we got to divide the screen by 2, divide this thing by 2, divide my object by 2. Then Flex came around and had a markup language to solve all that, and it's like, this is going to be the wave of the future. This is how our applications are going to go. Turns out it's really hard to update those things and like upgrade along that path. And then obviously the infamous Steve Jobs being like, Flash is dead, and so it became.
I mean, from my perspective, I was going to say, I think Flex, I say this all the time, Flex was the first React. Flex might as well have been React v1, because you see all the same trends where I saw a lot of backend developers that actually really enjoyed working in Flex that weren't traditional UI developers, and it was strongly typed, and you had compile time checking, you had all these things that people wanted out of air quotes applications that the web didn't have, which is the exact same escalation we're seeing now with React, except it's trying to build it in the web stack and arguably failing.
So we're kind of saying Flash might have been like the original SBA, excuse me. After that, right, I went on to work I went 7 years later after college and everything. Is like I go on and work as a front-end dev, and we're using Backbone, fronting a Rails app, right, and like some small apps, and then ultimately we start building an SPA, right? And we started running into...
That was a very 2007 sentence.
Yeah, and why did that happen, right? Like, why did we end in SPA land from Rails? Because Rails was fantastic for our marketing site, for our we had kind of, think of it like Wikipedia, right? So we had lots of educational content, and we're surfacing that stuff through Rails, and there's it needs to be SEO optimized and everything. And that, I think, was fantastic for that. There's no way you could ever argue that would be a good idea to implement as an SPA. You'd have a hard time selling anyone on that. But we started to be like, well, now we want to build an application for students, and we want to build an application for educators, and they're going to use that to read the content and play with flashcards and do quizzes and things like that. And could those have been separate pages? Yes, but those individual things were highly interactive, right? And also highly related. And so it's like, okay, we envisioned this product, and we started thinking about, is it going to run on iPads, right? And how can we minimize traffic to the server? AJAX, right? So I think that's kind of at least that's a path that I took into this SPA world, why we're there in the first place.
I'm remembering the first time, your example was Google Maps, but
we should walk the baby steps through this. We all took small steps to get here, right?
Yeah, there were even smaller steps before Google Maps would be oh, you mean I can click that button and it goes and does something and I don't have to refresh the page? I remember that blowing my mind, and just the gradual buildup of that, and that interactivity was awesome. It was such a breath of fresh air compared to a full refresh of an entire page.
Well, remember, and you have there were a lot of fixed sidebars and headers, and it was I don't have to reload that stupid thing. It can stay on the page. There's something visually very appealing about that, right? It never flickers. And then we started using the word round trip, right? What's your round trip? How long does it take? And a lot of times it's talking about 400 milliseconds, or, you're talking about these numbers, and then you start comparing that to AJAX, and you go, I can do that a lot faster because I don't have to send as much.
And you also mentioned that visual appealing nature. When's the last time you heard a flash of unstyled content? Remember that phrase? That was
oh wow,
where basically you're going in between two things, and it flashes because it hasn't been styled yet, because it hasn't loaded properly yet.
Yeah.
We don't get that in a single page application environment. I mean, sure, you have to handle loading states here and there, but that's sort of a solved problem now. We don't deal with that anymore. So that's another one of those let's check that box. Single page applications fix that. Yeah. So okay, now we got that. Oh well, I'm trying to think of other things that they solved at the time. like how we got down this. Like it started with AJAX, server load, performance kind of thing. Because you're right, like AJAX existed before Google Maps. I just use Google Maps as the
it was like the
pillar example.
First one that was like, whoa.
Yeah, it was enough to make me be like, how do I do that?
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, it's a great time to mention an acronym that I find a little silly, which is MPA, which is a multi-page app, which came out after single-page apps had been a thing and progressive web apps had been a thing. And when you look at that definition, you're like, so this is just the same client-server model we've had like since the dawn of time.
Like the
since
web.
the dawn of the web. Yeah, exactly.
You mean
it's like
a website.
Yeah, it's just a website. But it's funny that we call them MPAs now because they had to have some kind of marketing term that I'm pretty sure Google applied to it. But so now we have MPAs, and so you have, we'll call them MPAs and SPAs for the sake of the podcast. So we've had our MPAs, we've had them forever. We can still write them. Like they're real quick to write. That's like an established tech. But a lot of the time we solve these problems with SPAs because of certain pain points. So let's dive into that real quick. Like, what are some of those pain points that drive us to pick an SPA over an MPA? Because I would argue you could go the other way, that SEO, I know we have server-side rendering. I'm going to table that for a second. But, like, SEO is a problem, and SPAs create a problem there. So not only are we trying to solve problems with SPAs, we're also creating some. But for now, let's just talk about what we're trying to solve with an SPA.
Well, I mean, I'll take it, or at least I'll get us started. This question has, like, plagued me. I think it's a different question than why are they popular, because I think those are two different questions. There's what is the engineering challenge that we had historically that we resolved with an SPA, and I think that is a very different question than why are they popular.
I care about the first question, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just drawing that distinction
Sure.
because I think they're popular for reasons that have nothing to do with the problems they're actually solving. From my perspective, the fundamental problem that we're still writing single-page applications for is the failure of HTML and the failure of the platform. Because when you look at the landscape of the web technologies, look at what's happened to JavaScript in 2 or 3 short years. We have fetch and async await and query selector all, and we have, my God, what else do we have? Arrow functions and spread operators and sets. It's like JavaScript is just sprinting forward. And you flip over to CSS, and what do we have? We have Flexbox, which is just universally acclaimed by everyone, even non-web environments like Framer and Figma and React Native adopt the Flexbox model. We have grid, we have a subgrid spec, we have CSS properties, custom properties.
Variables.
I mean, it's just nesting. It's just, both those two technologies, because they can operate in relative isolation, are just sprinting forward, and no one's complaining about them. HTML are the actual, the interactive elements that we are building off of, unless we're going to just do divs forever, and it is just stuck because no one can agree on what the needs are of the web and what the controls should be. And so when we have these two really powerful tools and we have this thing stuck in the middle, we say, let's just go around it because we want to build rich user features.
So let me jump in there because I think that is a statement that a lot of people could miss what you're talking about there. So I think what you're talking about, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is, sure, we had HTML5, we got sections asides and all these like cool things, and people started talking about semantics. It sounds like what you're talking about is less about those things and more about the controls themselves. Inputs, sure, we have those, we have select, but I think I saw you talking about the other day the need for some of these more interesting controls that have become really ubiquitous in applications as we know them that just don't exist at that sort of atomic HTML level.
Absolutely. Like the most common one I would say is the modal. And we all know there is no such thing as a modal. There is just div-styled JavaScript-y stuff that you're jamming in the DOM with a fixed position somewhere and calling it a modal. We don't have good three-dimensional Z-layer APIs when we're building for the web. As opposed to anyone who's done React Native or iOS, it's sort of baked right in there, right? So we don't have that stuff. Or Flash, right? Yeah. We don't have that stuff. We have like window.confirm and we have z-index, and that's pretty much it. And so we're in this place where we want to build the type of user experiences that are coming out of the box from the walled garden ecosystems like Android or iOS. We don't have them, and so we said, well, you know what? We'll just use the power of JavaScript to circumvent them and build the things that it's taken, years to get a dialogue element, and even now it's like, I think it might get dropped from the spec. So there is a dialogue element in case anyone is unaware of that.
What are some others? Yeah, what are some others you talked about?
Tooltips, accordions.
Tooltips. That was one big one that I was like, oh, that's really interesting that we don't have that, because it just seems like such a no-brainer to me. Or a popover,
multi-select, select menu. I mean, there's just so many. There's so many different things that I see. I mean, the number one thing design systems rebuild after the button is the select.
Yeah.
Yep.
Autocomplete. Yeah, I mean, as someone that builds a lot of component libraries and thinks a lot about those things, it's like I enjoy the challenge of building them, and I see where there's got to be a huge challenge in getting different browser like vendors or whatever and developers to agree on a standard for those things. I think the big thing is every company wants
I'm thinking
their
of
app content editable. I mean, that's
like
a nightmare.
here's a feature that's like you kind of want something free form, and here you go. Like this is what you guys asked for, right? And we're like, no, we're gonna have to work around that. We have to write our own thing, to do that.
But isn't that kind of how we feel right now anyway about buttons, right? Like, there's like reset CSS states for everything, right?
I mean, we always think about like states as being like a Boolean, like button is disabled, button isn't. But it's like button could be loading, button could be disabled, button could have different text on different things. It could have a state inside of it. Like, there's a lot of extra state that goes into that stuff that we don't think about.
That's a great example because implicit in what you just said when you said button can be loading, that is an idea that represents someone's optimal user experience. And you could have this is a space I exist in, where I say, well, do I want to actually indicate my loading state on the button as a part of a form? Or, when you're working in, say, React Native or something, you might actually do like a Z-layer opacity and block all user interactions on the entire page for the entire viewport, right? So even that is like one microcosmic example of how we can't even agree when someone wants to. You have a form and someone clicks submit. How do we cancel the promise? How do we block them from doing something else on the page? How do we handle that? And no one can agree with it, and so we all just build our own, right?
All right. So let's circle back to the topic here. So we're talking about SPAs.
Yeah.
Why do you think the lack of these sort of column atoms or like particles, right? Like these tags. Why is the lack of these bring about SPAs in your mind?
I think the primary reason is because if you don't have the controls that you need out of the box that come with browser APIs, then you're going to have to write them from scratch in JavaScript. And then there's going to be an escalation in the bundle and shared aspects of that bundle from page to page to page to page. And so if you're also trying to handle your state in JavaScript and you're also building your custom controls in JavaScript, then so much of the user experience is JavaScript. And as you're going from one page in an MPA to another page in an MPA, and you're just having to deal with optimizing, we don't load all the components on one page and then you only need some on the other page. You just have all of these problems. You said, look, why don't we just make a bundle? We'll, compress this thing as hard as we possibly can, and then everything that they need, they just have, and we don't need to keep on dealing with fragmenting the user experience across all these different pages. It's just easier, and then just separating ourselves from the back end entirely. That's, I think, the sell.
I think that's really interesting. So when you said that, I was like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. I don't understand how HTML lands there. But it's funny because I totally agree with you. But the way that I thought about it was totally differently. And I think of things mostly just from sort of anecdotal experiences, which from my experience, we're using Rails, we're serving up bunches of pages, and just like you said, we got modals on those pages and they share certain styles, but the styles for those things like are baked into these little miniature applications that we're building in Backbone or what have you. And then those styles are like tied to one thing while we have other styles that are being served by the server. And now we're getting these problems where we're running into like different sources of truth, and developers hate this, right? So how do you get developers to like have dry code? Like we have the same implementation of a button, that's rendered from the server, coming down from the server as we do in our little app that lives in like a bunch of different pages and maybe on the marketing website as well. And so you start running into these problems and you go, we don't want to have those problems anymore. How can we get around that? How can we have one source of truth, one like unified code base? And I think that's kind of how we got there. It was also just the allure of like, you get front-end developers who get better and better and better, and they start realizing, oh, we can do transitions between this and that, and like build our own kind of view layer hierarchies and, move things around on the page and model those like relationships in the data. And I think everyone kind of just geeked out on the development, right? They're like, we can do new things, and therefore we must. And we did. And I feel like, I mean, years later, we still are, right? And we've gotten really good at it as a culture, right? We've built a culture around it where now we have so many tools at our disposal for doing this that like kicking off an SPA is literally a one-liner in your terminal now, which is fantastic, right? Like to come back to the very beginning of this episode, like you said, you're like, yeah, I'm a hammer and it's a nail, but it's like, yeah, but the hammer is like, it's so simple for you to do. Now, I think where Scott's going to interject is like what you just built with that one-liner is not inherently simple. You just built this big-ass thing, right? That's like, you know, the base with your React app and everything that does nothing is 400K or something like that, right?
Well, that is the first thing. The second thing I was going to say, too, which is the absolute core of the problem in my mind is the elevation of the developer experience over the user experience. And that is the thing that everyone's talking about. Where when we say, and that's great, I can make an app in one line. I go, it's great for you. And I said, then, you know, it's like, I was embedded in a team recently that installed all of the things. And we've all seen this before. It's like the React, Redux, Redux Saga, Immer. Then we're going to have a sort of fragmented code base. We're going to switch over to hooks. Then we're going to need context and suspense. We like GraphQL and Apollo. And you just go down and then listen. Of course, we need to have TypeScript, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all that stuff is the developer's view of how I like to develop.
Yeah, more layers between you and the metal.
And I just go into the analytics. It's the first thing I do because to me, like a solution is meaningless to me without really understanding the problem. So the first thing I do, every single app, every single design, I look at the user analytics. Who's using this thing? Where are they using it? What's their hardware? What's their software? What's their connection? And then I, to the degree possible, impersonate that and experience what developers are building as if I'm the person who's actually paying your salary. And I'm like, wow, you know, I'm loading this up. I'm in the Midwest on an iPhone 6 with a 3G connection, and it takes me 13 seconds to load a static list of 30 items. And you're just like, when we say, oh, and this is so good, it's like, don't be in your mindset, be in that person's mindset. You're going to have a very different idea of what good means.
So this ties back to what I was saying before about like we're trying to get that desktop feel in the browser. And yeah, that's a desktop feel. Loading times. Like that happens, you know? Like
Right.
I mean, that happens for all my desktops. Open up any Adobe thing or Microsoft thing, you get the logo while it's loading, and then it doesn't always take 13 seconds. Hopefully not. But so it's interesting that we've used those things. Like this is a great segue into when should you use a single page application? Because I would argue that if you have to deliver to someone in the Midwest and it's a 13-second load time, that's bad. If it's somebody who's like, I'm going to open up this, let's call it an EMR, which is like a
electronic medical record
exactly,
system.
yeah. So like medical record, they're usually these big cumbersome things, but most people just log into them once in the morning and are using them all day. So if your initial load time is 10, 20, 15, even 30 seconds for some of those people, they're probably not going to care. Now, that's a different audience, and you should still shoot for performance stuff anyway, but this is the whole like, okay, well, we were using single page applications for everything. Now what's the baby step to fix this loading problem? What's the baby step to fix this SEO problem? What's the baby step to fix this? And we're getting there. But at the same time, it's like, these are solved problems unless you need that single page app feel, that desktop feel. So I look at like Figma. So Figma has an Electron app. So it does have that desktop app feel, and it's great. And it's all built on web tech. And they have, for them, they're using, that's probably their primary application, and they're using the web as like, well, we'd like to deploy this on other things, so let's use this same technology to deploy to the web. And maybe they look at it reverse, maybe it's web first and then the Electron app. But point is like that's a great example of when you should use an SPA, because you want an app feel, it needs to live in a browser. You could have it in an Electron app, but like maybe a media site, for instance, that you like needs SEO, and it's like, well, let's build a single page app because it needs like that. You know how like when you're on YouTube you have like that always on player that like never leaves the screen? So if you're like a popular podcast or something like that, you might want that on your site. But that immediately brings up that like, okay, well, I know a good hammer for this. It's a pretty shiny hammer. Like it's even shinier because this one has SSR on it, so I'm going to use that to solve this problem. And it's like in the end, it's like all of that extra labor, extra little things for problems that we've solved already with MPAs, multi-page apps, also that I can have an always-on podcast player.
Yeah, I think of it, you know, I think we all kind of think of this the same way. It's like, well, what's the problem? Who's actually using it in the first place? I got to say, like, in the past couple years, I don't know that I've built many things that are consumer facing, where it's like, oh, this is a public application. I don't need to worry about SEO most of the time, and I bet that's very common. There's a lot of like B2B work being done in tech,
here.
Especially here. Yeah. So we're building a lot of things where we can take a lot of this stuff for granted, and we can go, well, what's your dev team look like? What are they, we're an agency, right? So we need to take their dev team into consideration. So this comes back to why maybe DX is being chosen over
DX
UX,
developer
experience. And that's maybe the first time I've used that term, but I'm very comfortable with it.
Note this moment in history.
Yeah, chalk this up.
Well, the business experience, I mean, that's what's interesting about that is I'm trying to think back. So this next year will be my 20th year when I first started in software, and 13 of those have been very high profile, consumer facing, I guess we'd call it public I'm trying to think of examples like it's
Wikipedia.
I didn't work on Wikipedia,
something
but
used by the general public.
Something used by the general public. Like I'll just take an example. Like if you worked for Discover and you're building Discover's site, it's like you have a lot of people that you need that are going to be using that, of a lot of different diverse needs and diverse boundaries on what they can actually handle on their hardware and software and their connections and everything else that you don't get to prioritize developer experience. And so for me, what's interesting is that I can't think of the last time I did anything B2B. The vast majority of my work has always been consumer facing, and that's why when I see the escalation of SPAs as an architecture, and I see it on consumer facing, like the most notorious one. Remember when Reddit did their rewrite? And I think they did React and style components. Am I the one who was paying attention to this?
I vaguely remember it.
Oh, this is in the last year or something, but you should have seen the rage on Reddit from Reddit users when things were just failing and they had these horrible performance problems and everything because you had a bunch of developers at Reddit that said, like, we're going to go all in on the React stack, and it totally blew up in their face, right? And so I think that's sort of the issue, is that we've seen it become, I work at some company, I'm building an internal tool, or I'm building a tool for another business that needs to interact with some data that we're going to share or something, and that's just slowly crept its way into the public sphere of the entire web. And that's why the voices at Google, like Alex Russell, Adi Osmani, all these guys, that's why they're starting to prescribe what you should do, because their quote is, the physics don't work. The pace at which we can optimize Chrome is necessarily slower than the pace at which you are actually increasing the JavaScript bundle.
Yeah, so I should bring it up real quick, so this is related, but like, when shouldn't you use an SPA? So I had a few notes here because I couldn't come up with a ton, but we talked about SEO being a primary concern, and while we do have Next and Nuxt and SS server-side rendering options for that, I would still say that for a lot of people, if you have SEO as a primary concern, Discover is a great example. Your audience is so fragmented, you can't just be serving them hot, shiny new stuff just if it's going to have a really huge impact on page load. Amazon.com, what do they say? Every 200 milliseconds of page load is an extra $40,000 lost or something like that, every day. Something I can't remember, some crazy stat like that. I'm making that up.
This dovetails
Jeff
into
Bezos
you are
probably.
not Facebook.
Yeah,
you're not Facebook.
Definitely not Amazon.
Yeah, and so
Call back to episode 4.
Yeah, so a few of these questions are I can see you wanting to not build an SPA if I was I'm thinking as a business owner, if I needed to hire someone cheap just to maintain something, you're always going to find someone who's I can do a Node expressing or Rails or something like that. They're probably going to be cheaper than your typical full stack senior engineer that can solve all those problems, has seen all these things before, knows not to go down the wrong paths when setting up certain systems. And then the other thing is these enterprise people, I'm thinking military, government, or really tight restrictions on what you can have for dependencies. Because I don't know what's in those. Create React app, one-liner, great developer experience. What's in there? I don't know.
So you're saying that's an example of when not to create?
Yeah, because
okay,
you have tight requirements
right.
over what's you're actually installing.
Yeah,
You don't know what the
okay.
licenses are. You don't know if there's a left pad thing that someone can just change and break your code one day. That could be a big problem for people like that. So I can definitely see in those situations being single page applications aren't even on their radar. I'm trying to think of other just telltale signs when you probably shouldn't use an SPA.
I mean, I have one, which is, and Scott kind of hinted at this when he was talking about, I just want to see a list of something. I'm talking about CRUD apps, right? This is what Rails is built for. It's just show me the thing, let me edit the thing, right? Like your URL structure on the client looks like the API RESTful.
Right.
Like it's all...
You have to input a bunch of data, and then you click a button.
Yeah.
And then you input a bunch more data, and then you click a button. Like, does that really need to be like dynamically rendered? And
Well, see, that was part of what drove all this in the first place. I always go back to the Angular demo of like the form input, because you're like, I could validate right there. Right there.
Yeah.
And then, like, everyone says that, it looks great, and then you start doing it, and you're doing it in the practice, and you're like, well, I still need to validate this data on the server because of, like, bad actors. You know what I mean? It's like, this data isn't always going to come in clean. It could come in from a bunch of different ways. So while my client-side validation is fantastic because I don't have to do that round trip to the server,
It's redundant.
it's like you end up having this redundant code in both places, all just so that you don't have to re-render a screen.
Yeah.
Which I feel like this comes down to, are we doing this for us? Or are we doing this for users? Like
Well-
the user versus developer experience.
Well-
Like developer experience for me, more meaning like my snobby nature. Like I run everything on an expensive computer. I want everything to act and behave a certain way because I live in this world all the time. But my grandmother does not care about the different. If Facebook reloaded every time she clicked a page, she would use Facebook just as much as she uses it now, which is quite a bit. And
Which is quite a bit.
just quite a bit.
I just got a picture of your grandma just
Yeah.
scrolling through Facebook all the
Just like liking everything and posting pictures
Yep.
of animals and so my point is that like that's something that like Facebook decided made sense, and maybe it made sense from a performance standpoint. Maybe it made sense for delivering to their end users or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like how many end users actually care about that experience?
And that to me is like there's two things there. One is just the detachment. I mean, so much of the work that I did, definitely in the middle of my career, which is a very humbling experience. If you have the opportunity, I can't encourage people to do it enough, is that I'm trying to think of, this was pre-Rocket. I wrote a bunch of code for a client, which I won't mention, but they had me, I did the design and did all the development, and then I had to do usability testing. And I had to sit there with 4 screens for an entire day of running 4 people at a time, stumbling through something that I designed and wrote every single line of code for, where I just integrated with a REST API that was from .NET developers. And watching people stumble around something that you've built and watch them get frustrated and talk to a moderator or what, I don't know what you call someone.
Facilitator.
Yeah, facilitator, and saying, I can't get this thing done, or why is the button not working, or where's the thing? When you watch someone stumble around with your work and you actually have to expel that weird combination of shame and empathy, you become a fundamentally different developer, where you're no longer able to see your development environment as this pristine thing. Kind of what you said, where it's like, look at us, we're like sitting, we have $4,000 laptops, and we all have the greatest phones, and we have only the finest craft brew IPAs from the local place, and we have the cucumber water from the bevy, and it's like we're sitting here like Marie Antoinette, be like, let the peasant users eat cake.
Rocket's hiring.
That's right, yeah. And if you want to come work here, you too can punish your users.
We'll edit that one out.
I like it. Yeah.
But I mean, that's what it is. I mean, we have become it almost bleeds into an economic conversation. We have
This is an industry-wide problem.
We have so drastically elevated the supply side of the production and our insular views of how we want to work that we're just like installing a third swimming pool for no good reason.
There's also that other problem that like most people have no idea what we do. Even the people who, like, if you do like your typical software company, you have product owners and product managers, and a lot of the time they're non-technical. So they're relying on their engineering team to tell them what the right choice is. And it's like, oh, well, we could solve this with Svelte, but we're going to have to do a little bit of refactoring. It's like, well, how much is a little bit? And you're like, I don't know, a few weeks. And like 9 months later, you're like, all right, we're on Svelte 3. And it's like, okay. So they also take our word for it, but we're picking a lot of these choices, whether we think we are or not. So maybe we're leading ourselves down these paths.
Well, if you guys heard of the term resume-driven development,
No.
RDD, like
Yeah.
this is a joke, obviously, but like this was a thing. I don't know.
Throw it on there, then learn it.
Well, mostly like I'm not doing this for the good of the problem. I'm not doing this for the good of the user. I'm doing this for me, for my career. And I always people around here have heard me say like, oh, there's a lot of people out there trying to justify their job, right? And I feel like there's a lot of that happening right now, like, and not just on front end, really just anywhere, Kubernetes on the back end. But like, there's a lot of that, like, just I'm flexing. This is really complicated. I'm flexing. I know this pays a lot. I got to get this on my resume. Like, there's a bunch of libraries I got to learn. I don't know. I'm just starting to sound jaded.
No,
but
you're right. Like that, we see that all the time. I mean, it's very, very true.
I feel like it's true. but I don't think it's so true. I think it's very cynical, and I do think
It
it's
is
actually
cynical.
a cultural thing. Like, it's one thing to say that happens with like one developer, but that developer has to have the actual freedom to make that choice. In my experience, it's actually been more of a team thing, and in my experience, it's actually been great. You know, when we decided to move to React from Backbone, first of all, everyone was like, JSX, what? Why is there HTML in my JavaScript? And we all freaked out for a bit, but we all geeked out, you know, and we got really into it. And ultimately, you know, I think we did do it for the right reasons, but to say that, you know, what you're saying wasn't part of it, wasn't like sort of wanting to keep up with the industry, wasn't part of it, you know, would be unfair. That said, there is another argument to make, which is that you have to kind of follow the bell curve, right? If you get caught on either end of the
You
bell
mean in
curve,
your own career for the good of yourself?
no. I mean,
just-
like, if you're building a product that's going to live for a while,
I see.
there's a
Yeah,
point
yeah.
where support for those dependencies of that product
Yes.
is going to peter out.
100%.
So if you're on the bleeding edge and you're using Svelte 3, you're going to have some pains. But if you're also using Angular 1, you're going to have some pains.
Well, yeah, you can't find people to support
There's
it.
a reason why the middle of this bell curve, there's a reason why React is so big, and it's because of sheer volume. They just happen to be there now.
They basically reached critical mass. It's just like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
the timing was great.
This is the part where I feel
back
like
mover status.
the I deviate from the explanation that React is popular because React is good or has good outcomes, because I think it's different than that. I think what's
No, it's
interesting.
inherently good.
Well, I mean, when you take a step back, I think this is part of the conversation that's missing, which is almost part of it's technical, part of it's non-technical, where we've almost detached who's building it and why are they building it? What are they trying to solve? And there's a reason why React has to solve problems like virtualization, because they are monetizing engagement and they don't want to have an interrupt as you're scrolling through a feed.
Sure.
We need to keep you engaged, so we need to have virtualization, and we have problems that we need to solve that the platform has no interest. Discover doesn't need to virtualize. Facebook does, right? And there's a reason why when you look at Svelte, which is all, you know, the rage right now in terms of conversation, we all know where that's coming from, right? Or maybe we don't.
Twitter?
No,
I don't.
New York Times. Rich Harris works in New York Times. New York Times has a very different set of problems
Oh, yeah.
than
They
Facebook.
need these, like, highly dynamic little widgety things.
Little
all over
widgety
their
things,
site, yeah.
visualizations for an article. It's content driven.
That's great.
I need it too, though. Honestly, the stuff that I'm working on right now, I'm running into all kinds of performance things with React and re-rendering and stuff that if I had Svelte and I didn't have to worry about memoization, right, and about like caching large chunks of data, like there's so many things, or like re-rendering like certain parts of the app where it's like, well, this is heavy because it's a big heavy graph, right, and building a visualization analytics platform, right. If I didn't have to worry about that stuff and I could let Svelte just be Svelte and do it, I feel like it would make a lot of problems that I'm trying to solve better for the developer and for the ultimate user, right? Because it's just fast, right? And now I can focus on solving something else or the next problem.
But I'll go take you one further there. So Vue 3, which is coming out soon, has already outperformed Svelte 3 in terms of performance.
You're
so it's
blowing my mind.
So it's sort of like, there's a shiny new thing. What are you going to jump on? You know, it's like,
I don't know.
Yeah, it was Svelte yesterday, but is it going to be tomorrow?
This is the VDOM, no VDOM debate, right? Because that's the, you know, Svelte, what's their angle is essentially just, it's compiled in, I guess what you could pejoratively call Svelte script, right?
Yeah.
And it's abandoning the virtual DOM. And Evan Yu is like desperately trying to prove that the virtual DOM can be as fast. And so there is a little bit of
It's competition. It's healthy.
market-driven
It's good.
hype that we're doing here, which is good. But I think that is sort of the core of the problem. When you were what you say, or so what you refer to as resume-driven development, I think it's more or less the same thing, but I often call hype-driven development, which is this idea that something's coming out and other people are talking about it. I'm a developer. I'm suffering from imposter syndrome or some maybe fear that I'm not going to be as marketable to other companies. And so there's this, like, it's almost like a nuclear escalation where everyone's chasing this thing. The anecdote I always tell is that I was embedded with this team, and this was the last direct conversation via Twitter that I ever had with Dan Abramoff, where he
blocked you forever.
Yeah, and it was funny. I actually shared it internally, but he shared Immer, which was essentially some mutable ergonomics on top of.
It's Michael Westrade's.
Yeah, and he was trying to
MobX
make Redux still be immutable but feel more like MobX, right? And I saw that tweet. I was sitting in bed, 10 o'clock at night. I saw that tweet, and I was like, "This is getting absolutely out of control." And then the next day, I was with the team, and before the end of the day, they had it installed. and I was like, this is my nightmare. Someone just says something, and we're like, cool, we'll install tomorrow. I couldn't even believe it. And that the conversation I had with him was, I said, I'm paraphrasing myself, but it's something to the effect of, worth considering if you need a global state management pattern that is immutable, and then you need to install additional libraries on top of that to make it have mutable ergonomics so that it's actually viable for your development team, you might have something systemically wrong with your architecture approach.
Yeah.
And his response was, maybe you should stop following me. Which maybe we can cut that out. But I was like,
so.
All right, okay. And that was the moment, right?
Yeah.
Where I said we jumped the shark.
Yeah, I think we jumped the shark a while ago before we realized it.
But the resume-driven development thing, like, you're right. It was very cynical, and I brought it up just because I thought it would be kind of funny. But, like, I'm not saying that, like, it's not like people are selfish. I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's just like, if I don't learn this in 2 years, I'm gonna be old news. I'm not even going to be able to get hired. I think people fear that.
I had that fear at my old job, and I distinctly remember getting really mad because I hired contractors like us now to come in and build this hot new thing with, I think it was, I don't even remember what it was at the time, but it was some technology that I found interesting and I really wanted to work on, and I'd been very vocal about that. And then they just passed it off to a contractor that would cost way more. And I was like, what the heck? And so I was like, I'm just going to leave because you're not letting me innovate and learn. But I remember that being like a really, really big driving factor for me leaving that company.
Right.
I wonder if that's just the thing with developers in general, something kind of in our DNA where we're kind of, you want to learn new things and you want to solve problems and like understand things from different angles. So it's fun to learn the new thing. But at the same time, it's this kind of space race where we're all like, more, next thing, like, let's move on. And I don't know, it's
I think a little of that is healthy, but like, it feels like we've like gone off the deep end a little bit. Like you said, like the space race. I like that idea.
It's funny, like when we talk about it, it feels like we've gone off the deep end. But at the same time, I'm like, I'm having fun out here in the middle of the ocean or wherever the heck I am. Like, I'm having a blast working on what I'm working on. And it's like, is it fun when you're working on something that you believe is super bloated and is not serving the user? No, absolutely not. And I think that's something we should all be striving for as engineers, is like, we should not be building something that is ultimately not serving the bulk of our users.
Or miserable to work on from a developer experience.
You don't want to work on it if it's miserable to work on, right? But I think you don't even have to make that point right now, because right now we have the power. Like, you can get money from a million different companies are going to hire you regardless of like how good you are, So it's like, they're going to let you do it whatever like cool way you want to. I think it's our responsibility to do it a way that's like serves the user and ideally is like serving them, right? But because it's serving their users well.
So I just want to interject real quick.
Yeah.
So I think we would all agree rhetorically that we are employed by companies that are ultimately delivering digital solutions to users. Users are essentially, for the most part, whether it's B2B or business to consumer, users are the reason why we are employed. Yeah. But with the hype-driven model, we think we're employed because of our ability to keep up with whatever insane thing popped into our news feed in the last 16 minutes. And so I guess the thing I would say to you is, if we're all agreeing that what's in the best interest of the user is the thing that should be driving our decisions, how do we quantify that? How do we actually determine what is in the best interest of the user? How do we take the user's experience and turn it into a prescription for what you're going to install in your development environment?
Like, how do you get people hyped up over that instead of hyped up over Svelte?
That's the thing that is plaguing me.
I think you need to ask personally, and I think there are different personality types around this. If you get really into it, you can look in the psychology and stuff and start like figuring out how to talk to people and everything and like what they care about. For me, I think anyone who's ever managed me realizes that they have to explain why we're doing any given thing, because if I don't know why, I have zero motivation to do it, right? It's like, why am I building this? Who is actually using it? What's the ultimate goal?
But that comes from your jaded experience, because you've been at enough places where features are just someone comes up with it off the top of their head. Some exec is like, I just want it.
I don't know that that's true.
Oh, okay.
I've actually had a very like rosy path to where I am today. I feel like all the stuff I've worked on has been really fun.
This way is in such a good mood all the time. You and I are like, really, that hasn't been my experience.
But I can't. I definitely am familiar with the other side of it, and I've worked for some clients where I'm like, well, I feel like this is too bloated of a solution, but I like understand what we're ultimately doing. But I think people need to ask that. They need to care, and I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel like if you're working for really large clients or a really large company and you're trying to service users, it's so much harder because there's so much stuff between you and them. That's a harder, I don't know what the answer is there. Like, how do you get in touch with that? Like, sometimes they'll have sessions where they'll actually do UX sessions. And I mean, talk to people on the design team. They're a little bit closer than you. If you're in design, talk to the UX people. They're closer than you to the users. They should be really close, you know? So I think it's a communication thing, really.
When I'm coaching more junior developers, that's one of the main things that I always tell them is, if you think you have a stupid question, chances are you don't. You need to ask it. Just ask why all the time. Just ask why, and you'll be surprised at the answers you get, number one. And you know what? Like, you might turn out to be the only person who knows the real answer to that. Like I'm just thinking, like, you know, when one of the questions we're going to talk about, like, when should you build an SPA? I'm thinking about the project I'm going into right now, and it's like, we're going to build an SPA. And I'm sitting here going, why are we going to build an SPA? You know what I mean? I think there might be a perfectly good reason. In fact, there probably is. Whoa. All right. Opposite opinion. But, like, going back to what you said, like, it's important to just ask that, right? Like, just know the reason.
Well,
like,
yeah.
Really know it.
The advantage of asking why is sometimes if you ask it enough times, you realize you didn't have to do the thing at all.
Yes. I was going to yell really loud.
Even need it. Like,
well, this is the 5 whys which came up from, like, Eric Ries in the Lean Startup or whatever it was, which is like, dive into when you have a bug, an issue, something you want to dive into, but it's just as good for a million other use cases like this. Why do we need it in the first place?
Yeah. Or who? I mean, it's so often that things just get lost in translation, right? Like, the product person talks to the designers and they misinterpret something and they hand it off to you, and, like, you just need to break down those walls.
Ground control, our internal thing we use to find out, like, who's on the bench, who's rolling off projects, that kind of stuff. That is a single page application. It's Vue. We've had other people who have, like, downtime who'll pick it up and work on it and, like, add new features and refactor some stuff, but it's still Vue. And it's Vue because Jesse wanted to learn how to write Vue while he was drinking his glass of wine at night. Now, I should have mentioned before, but it's like, that's a really funny reason for that legacy to stick around, because you just wanted to try it out. And sometimes that's how it ends up being. Like, these things, we live with these decisions for a long time because we wanted to try a new thing, or it came from some higher up because that's how we wanted it, or someone needed an always-on podcast player, but do you?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just like, I mean, in the spirit of the title of this podcast, he shipped it because of that, right? Like, maybe he didn't want to do it the other way. And, like, if it's one of these 20% time things or a hack week or whatever it is you got at your company and it motivates you, I mean, look at some of the best products out there are things that people built because they just got jazzed about something, right? And sometimes we just get jazzed about the tech that we're going to build it with, which sounds so stupid.
It doesn't. I mean, maybe it does to other people, but it doesn't to me. It sounds it resonates with me in a big way. Like, I totally understand that, because, I mean, I was just saying, I was, like, taking that CSS grid course just because I wanted to, like, get sharp on that, and, like, now I'm jazzed about it because, like, it was fun. It was fun going through it, and I want to learn more, and I want to dive deeper, and I don't need that right now, but I want to do it.
On that note, maybe it's a good idea to start talking about, like, future tech, actually, like where we see, like, maybe going away from SPAs, or maybe there's some things that solve problems that SPAs solved, but without kind of adding the heavy package and the other sort of negatives that we've talked about.
Well, I'll let Scott take it over, but we talked about routing. You know, routing on the client has always been a challenge. Routing on the server is sort of just like, just comes out of the box, like, you just get it. But doing, like, that, you know, keeping the URL looking nice without having it have, like, the pound sign in it, which is what the hash history. You know, people really care about that. Remember, like, mod rewrite in Apache? Like, people really cared about those, like, really nice looking URLs that didn't have the index.php in it. So you would mod rewrite that piece out. It's the whole thing. So routing is obviously probably one of the driving reasons why we do a lot of the things that we do. That was a really wide brush. But so routing is important. Scott, we had this conversation the other day. If you were going to, well, I'll just, go ahead and take the.
Yeah, well, so Brandon, actually, I was going to say you treated, it was Ryan treated me to a Guinness.
Yeah.
And we were having this conversation as we do, and just do sort of, you know, after hours ranting of all things tech. And I was trying to deconstruct how we got here. And one of the things I was putting myself in the position, said, okay, let's just say I'm head of an engineering organization, but I can't get, you know, like, neck deep in the mud checking PRs. I'm, you know, wasting time in meetings or whatever people do at that level. what is the like minimum prescription I could make on an engineering team to make sure that they don't absolutely shoot themselves in the foot? And I think a lot of times with the sort of React, anti-React dichotomous hate that gets flowing back and forth, a lot of things fell on the bus. Like a lot of people said, "Oh, we have context. We don't need Redux anymore." There's a lot of, I think, symptoms of the disease that aren't the actual disease. And the thing I said to Brandon was the most important and least intrusive prescription I can make to an engineering team is totally platform and ecosystem agnostic. I would say you can't install a router. Can't route in the client. And once you pull that out of the equation, if you have to, from one page to another page, have to go back to the server, then if you were going to use Redux or something, you would always be limited to the scope of what you'd send on one page, which is always going to be limited to the scope of what a actual user can keep inside of their head cognitively in a given view. And so there would no need to be like splitting reducers and combining them and have all this crazy stuff. And then if you're going back to the server anyway to fetch fetch data and render your view, then you've just all of the other things that you would install that you're trying to put under the paradigm of an app. I'm building an app. There's no such thing as an app. There's no such thing as a modal. It's a make-believe thing that we've sort of said. If you took the router out of that, I think everything would just evaporate, and you could say you can install whatever you want. You want to install TypeScript for one page?
Okay,
Have at it.
So here's where I think it's so interesting the way you see that, and it's very observant. It's like, oh yeah, you get rid of the router, state management all of a sudden feels like lightweight and fluffy. And I think a lot of developers are like, yeah, let's get rid of that. At least I was for a second. I was like, let's throw it out the window. But then I started thinking about the project I'm working on and all the utilities and the like sort of derived state that I get out of like basically slicing and dicing these gigantic arrays and objects and stuff in all these different ways. And I would need that functionality on multiple pages, right? And I need that stuff shared anyway. And I think what I'm getting at is like, or what I'm curious about, and this is so much like the hype-driven development thing, I want to know what's like going on with Nuxt and Next. I haven't played with these things yet. I have done sort of the roll your own isomorphic universal app thing, and that worked well. My view on this right now, like at least the way it's currently loaded and it's loosely held, is that if you're not doing JavaScript on the server, if you don't have a single source of your markup and CSS, right, then you're going to run into the same problems we did when we came into the SPA world, and we're going to end up right back where we are now. And so, like, are we solving, like, do Nuxt and Next kind of solve those problems? I'm seeing nodding. That's exciting.
So. Yes. I mean, for me, yeah.
Talk to me. I want to know.
Go. Yeah, you most recently worked on a Next thing. I've worked on a Nuxt project.
So it might help for somebody to discuss, like what the differences are, because me, I'm sitting over here like I don't really.
Do you want to do the elevator pitch? Want me to do it?
Whatever you want, you go for it.
Okay, sure. So Next.js is a you can think about it like a React-based thing. Like create React app is a one-liner you type in, and it kind of walks you through the whole setup of a project. Well, Next.js does the same thing, but it installs other things for you. It gives you a router. It gives you some testing utilities out of the box. It sort of gives you. It's like the thing that we all went away from for a while, which is like I want to pull everything that I want off the shelf and choose it myself. Well, I think people got annoyed with that, and so now we have these nicer tools where all the tooling is built in. It's performant. It's meant to run with the choices they give you. So you can do that. But the real key here. So I should also mention that Nuxt is the same thing, server side rendered, but it's for Vue. So Next.js and then Nuxt was like inspired by that. So hence the slight spelling difference there. So the thing that they solve primarily is what's called SSR, or server-side rendering, which is essentially the way this works is when Google crawls a page, they don't click through it like a user does. It's like they're not loading up a browser window and clicking through and like dealing with that single page app. They're hitting URL, end of story. Let's hit another URL. It's like hitting a refresh page on every single aspect of your app. Now, if you did that with a regular single page app, Google sees the same markup underneath it all the time. Never changes. It's whatever that original page was, and it's not great because obviously your page is changing, but the markup doesn't show that, so Google doesn't know it. So this SSR solution solves that by when Google hits the page, they're going to get the markup for the page, and the first time you hit the page, you're going to get that markup too. As a user, though, it becomes like single page application mode after you've loaded that first page. The markup underneath the hood isn't really changing. It's just you're living in Shadow DOM world. You're clicking through. You're in single page app land. But when Google's crawling it, or any like kind of bot is crawling it, they're gonna drive to these pages where you get an extra hook essentially to provide the data that's going to land in your markup.
Does that usually translate to a faster initial page load for the user as well?
Absolutely.
Or not?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Makes sense.
Because you don't
I was
have
going
to
to say
wait.
it depends, but I like absolutely. Yeah.
You don't have to wait for the JavaScript bundle, right? So right there, that's a big win. Then you start talking about time to interactive, but that's still a huge win. I think the way that I think about this, because all that's in abstract can be really confusing if you haven't gone down this path, but imagine a list that you get down from a server that just shows you a bunch of tiles, and you want to be able to drag and drop and reorder that list. And you want to use something that's expressive like React to represent those things. If you get that list from the server, you're going to get markup that's defined on the server, and you're going to get CSS that's defined on the server. And now you got to repeat that same code in your client, right? And that's where you run into trouble, because you render this thing, but your client React has to like notice that that is the same exact thing. Otherwise, it's going to flicker and re-render that thing with its own slightly different version of it, right? And if the styles don't match, it's not good. So this is where I say the JavaScript or the source of your markup and styles have to be exactly the same for both. Ideally, you have JavaScript on both like the server and the client. So that way, when you render it, whatever JavaScript app is picking it up, this is where we talk about hydration, it goes, that's the object that I'm controlling, and there's no update whatsoever because the thing that rendered it was using the same piece of code that rendered it from the server, the thing that re-renders it as you change it on the client. That, I think, is such a huge win for like just the initial rendering and speed of an application, but it can introduce like development headaches and like subtle complications. Like if you needed to generate a unique identifier or something like that and use that on the page, you run into some like weird things that you don't have to worry about if you're doing like an SPA. So there are these gotchas there. So if you're doing this sort of thing by yourself and you're working with like junior developers, they might break the app by accident, right? So these are the types of things that I wonder how Next and Nuxt, like how
that was
going to
be my next question: is do they solve any of those things?
At least in my experience, so I've done multiple Nuxt apps, which is the Vue flavor, and one Next app, and they're essentially getting first class support now from the Chrome team. This is essentially where we are going. To the degree to which I have my finger on the pulse of the future landscape, which I think I have a really good one.
I have no idea.
Yeah, this is where we're going to go because I built multiple of them, and they really, the two of them are just have feature parity. So like Brandon said, where your routing is just directory driven. You make a file in a folder called pages, and it just builds your router behind the scenes. And then they both have these APIs. So if you're going from one page to another page, there's an API Nuxt, which is called async data. The API in Next is called get initial props. And essentially what that's saying is before I have some data dependency asynchronously that I need to execute on the server. So you got to flip your mental model where the traditional client server model separation is still there. You just have, it's a server relationship, and you're just leaning on the server where we would be traditionally leaning on the browser for rendering and fetching. So essentially you're saying you still have a single page app, except you're taking the stuff that can live on the server, which is routing and fetching and rendering, and you're saying, hey, let's run this on the server and then give me only the things I need that have to go to the browser, which is a lot of static HTML and CSS, and only the JavaScript for client-side interaction. And that's how it solves the problem.
Yeah, I was going to ask like a philosophical question because we were just mentioned routing, right? Like, oh, if you take away routing from the client, then what are you left with? And I was thinking about Next and Nuxt, where the routing is a directory-based structure. It's a convention. That's the default way to do it. And behind the scenes, it figures out the routing for you, right? It's a lot of this magic in the tooling, and we've all agreed that we're okay with that magic at this point. But now my question to you that's philosophical is that routing on the client or server?
I mean, I consider it routing on from the user's perspective, it is routing on the server. As far as
from a technology perspective, it's we don't even know. It's like an abstract thing now. It's
right.
Like,
yeah. I mean, so I think if we want to get like deep in the philosophy of
it's like a red pill, blue pill
even the
thing.
philosophy of technology, it is. You know, it is like the hybrid child of it's the dyad and the force or something, right? It's the hybrid child of some unholy client server-ish thing. But for practical purposes, I think we can just call it that server-side routing.
Well, it's weird. I mean, if I think about the way I used to handle a server, like a node server, the request comes in. Okay, here's my GET request. I'm going to pull some query params off of that. I'm going to go fetch something from Mongoose or whatever, and then I'm going to return this data, either an API or maybe it's an HTML page at the end of the day. But in this Next and Nuxt land, it's like none of that. It's basically like I have some functions somewhere. Maybe I wrote them in a utility file or whatever, but it's that one little hook that they give you. Get initial props or async data. And that's the hook you get to be like, here's where this is my server. Is that one method? That's your server, and that's a totally different way to think about it.
That's really interesting
kind
when
of
we talk about it. Yeah.
It's all like abstracted away now. So it's funny. I had down here like, how do we fix this problem? And I'm like, I feel like they're fixing it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it sounds like this is a pretty good direction.
Yeah. Like it's funny. I kind of came in here all like grumpy and and now we're talking about. I'm like, yeah, Next and Nuxt, they're kind of nice.
I mean, it sounds like a really rosy picture. Is like most of the state management just happening by virtue of like storing it in a database, and then when you need it again, you're requesting it from the database?
I mean, we need to divide two types of state management, right? Like, in a really concrete example, there's what Matt always says, which I love, which is state management that is essentially just a proxy for replicating your database on the client, right? There's that kind of stuff, which we've seen happen in, like, Redux explosion. But then there's also... you have a responsive sidebar that you click on a hamburger menu, and you need to have this is sidebar open piece of Boolean logic that exists that needs to persist from place to place to place. Those are two very different things. Like, async data is not for is sidebar open. That you would probably still have Redux or context or Vuex or whatever it would be. You would still use that for your global application state management from the client's perspective.
Yeah, but it's like UI specific.
Yeah, but if you're fetching data from a database,
that's in your
server
method.
That is in your API for get initial props or...
That makes total sense.
Right?
It does, except there are always gotchas for these sorts of things, which is like, well, how do you deal with performance when you're talking about sending and receiving lots of data? Like, if I just downloaded a really big thing, or I sent up a really big thing and I have it in my hands, why would I want to load that really big thing again?
You can take care of all that with the state. So in Nuxtland, it comes bundled with Vuex, which is like, this is by the same Vue team, but they're like, this is the state management solution we're going to give you. So you could have it all managed there, so it would be like memoized and it wouldn't get fetched again. Or you could do it at a component-based level, but you have a few different ways to pull that in. My point is that like that function is sort of where you have to, whatever data you want to show in that markup, you got to make sure it's ready inside that function.
So they kind of prescribe the path for you. I mean, this whole thing sounds very Railsy, which I love, and I bet some people will not love. But yeah, it's very. I really love when there's a strong opinion about how you should do things, because as a developer, you come in and if you understand that thing, you go, well, this is how it should be. This is where it should be. It's not here, therefore it probably doesn't exist. Whereas in something that's like hand rolled, or if you're using, what flavor of Redux are you, like how do you store stuff? You might have to look in multiple places.
It's custom, like that ghetto flex thing I wrote.
The early days.
Yeah.
The point you just said, which I think is really important, is that how you said you sort of like that Rails-y prescription. This is how we do it. When I walk in, I know how it's done. I feel the same way, but I actually go a layer higher. I hate being vendor locked. When I see a pattern, I want to know, okay, let's say I ripped out my proprietary dependencies. Am I still using that pattern? If the answer is no, then as far as I'm concerned, that just has no business being in my bundle. And so what I like about looking at these SSR solutions is that they are hand-in-hand working with the Chrome team, and they are working on what the API should look like. And so you might prefer using arrow functions as opposed to and hooks as opposed to Vue single file components. That to me falls under developer experience. That might be your preference. I might prefer the other way. But as long as we both have a concept of whether it's get initial props or async data, this is the overall pattern. We are still using directory-based routing. We are still fetching our data in a very specific API. We're still rendering, and then we're hydrating. Like, that's the stuff that transcends whatever flavor you might prefer, and that's the stuff that I'm really concerned with.
Yeah, so it's like app logic, do it how you want. Everything else that's, sort of, if you were to abstract common patterns that we see pop up in every app, it's like, let's have some strong opinions about those things and let's implement them.
Shared strong opinions.
Nah, I don't want to share.
Well, it sounds like we have different views of the future, but we're all feeling good about it, except for Matt.
I'm dystopia.
I'm just messing with you.
I was like, oh man, I must have a bad look at my video.
No,
I'm actually really, after hearing you explain Next, I'm really excited about that concept. That's like putting standards around what I feel like kind of I always say like the pendulum. It feels like the pendulum swings, right? It swung way too far over to the client side, and like that's a little bit of a step to the pendulum swinging backwards. I like that.
Yeah, I think we're starting to like hone in on those conventions, and you're seeing them come out of it. And this is a whole other podcast, and maybe it will be, but it's like we have the heroes that we have chosen to lead us are like Facebook and Google and people like, Paul Irish and Adi Osmani and Tyler McGinnis and Ken C. Dodds, like all these people who are like famous for being like writing a bunch of tooling and talking about it a lot, and we just follow them. And so we have to put our faith in the right people or do it ourselves. We are running a little long. Should we wrap it up and do picks?
I think we should.
Okay. Well, I'll kick it off. So I'll pick one. Actually, I'll pick two because it's quick, and why not?
Okay.
Okay, no, I'll pick one. I'll pick one. I like it.
I'm going to make you choose.
I like constraints.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I'm going to choose the Oculus Quest, which is a VR headset. Facebook owns Oculus. Now, they have two. They have the Oculus Rift S and the Oculus Quest. The Rift S is the one you plug into your computer, and you have to be tethered to like a powerful, beefy computer, and great, that's how like most VR is. The Quest is not. It's untethered. It has cameras on the front of it. You don't need motion sensors in the room. They just added hand tracking as an experimental feature, so like we're soon not going to need controllers anymore either. You can just use your hands. I played with it the other day. Works pretty good. Works pretty well. So it's fantastic. In my mind, it is the console of VR.
Just sold me. All right, mine's another podcast. If you're into audio at all and you haven't heard the 20,000 Hertz podcast, I'd highly recommend it. They dive deep into one story in every episode about sound. So there's one really good episode that I like about audio tags and like audio branding and all these different sounds that like the NBC chime and things like that. Just really good storytelling in general, even if you're not into audio. Great podcast.
Sweet. Mine is VizHub with a Z. It's developed by my friend Curran, who I studied with, and it's a fantastic visualization platform built in JavaScript, and Curran's really passionate about sort of democratizing this sort of stuff and helping to educate people. So it's a great sort of initial platform to play around with, even if you're new to JavaScript. It's great to play around with if you're interested in visualizing any sort of data, or honestly just like playing with stuff and seeing like kind of instant fun feedback. This might have been a good thing. I think we had some kids over here from a middle school program recently.
Yeah, Code and Circuit.
Might have been kind of cool to like put something together quickly for them in that. But it's a fantastic effort by a fantastic person. So I just want to encourage people to check it out.
VizHub.com, Viz with a Z.
Viz with a Z. I think VizHub.com. Just Google it.
Yeah,
we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
All right, I'm going to stay with tech too. So mine is, surprise, surprise, Lighthouse. I hit on this all the time in Rocket Slacks. It is a auditing tool built right into Chrome that is gaining more features and gaining a little more popularity as the weeks go by. Essentially what it is if I had to describe it, it's like pulling permit for your web app. So if you have your house and it's your primary investment vehicle for your entire life and you're going to pay this thing off and you have a problem with the roof or your plumbing stack or your electrical, you don't want Chuck with a truck who went to a 16-week roofing or intensive coming over and just knocking away at your house. You want to pull a permit. You want to make sure the work is done right. And, for moving it over to tech, we exist in a postmodern hellscape of an elevation of all opinions over facts.
Hot take.
Right.
All right.
So we need to move the needle back. We need to actually have some standards. We need to have something that we agree upon is tooling that tells us whether or not we are actually doing our jobs right. And Lighthouse is the first thing I've seen that's really easy to use and just gives you this nice, beautiful green circles that says you've got 100% on performance or accessibility or SEO or whatever else the priorities are if you're building a PWA or not. And it's not comprehensive. It doesn't do everything automatically. It does give you a list of things to manually check, but it is the first thing I've seen that I just stop right there. I go look at an app and I say, well, this feels terrible from a user's perspective. And I look at the DOM and I run Lighthouse and I say, these are my facts. My value assessment is based on actual factual reality. This is objectively bad. And so I would say, if you're a developer and you're sweaty and you want to build something good, this is going to give you beautiful immediate feedback that you are actually doing a good job.
I want to double down on your sell. So for developers who are working at a company or in a situation right now where you have like a lot of tech debt and you can't find the excuse to do the work because your product person's all over you, take a screenshot of your Lighthouse circles and send it to them and be like, we want to make these better. Like that's something that you will feel real good at the end of.
Can we throw a little shade? This is a great example. We recently did lightning talks internally, and we ran Lighthouse on Jira. I did it on the Jira backlog. And just do it. If you're listening to this podcast, go to the Jira backlog, load up a bunch of stuff for a fairly, medium to large size company, and just run Lighthouse and see what comes back. It's going to be fun. Yeah.
I think we found the subtitle for our podcast.
Yeah.
Are we living in a postmodern hellscape? Question mark.
You should just rename the entire podcast.
I like that.
Postmodern hellscape?
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah. Just a real quick note on the Lighthouse thing too. So we've been, and the next thing it all ties in. So we were using that recently with Zeit and deploying it there. And I believe this is true. And correct me if I'm wrong because you're using it. They do automatic Lighthouse audits or something like that.
Yeah, there's an integration. So every single, I mean, Zeit's been actually a really nice, integration with Next. So essentially, what I've done is I'm building this app, and every time I push up a branch or something, I'm working where I'll get a sort of deployment URL for just that branch, and then I have Lighthouse integration running, so that I'll just see a history of all of my Lighthouse audits for every single branch that I've actually pushed and merged, and so I can look over and say, oh, I was scoring 100% of performance, and I dropped to 98. What happened between these two merges that actually degraded my performance or my accessibility score, whatever it is? You can actually not only just look at it at a point in time, but see the change of your scores as you're working on your app. And so imagine if someone was working on Jira or whatever it is, you could look at the history of, oh yeah, look at how it went. It was like 100, and then 98, and then 92, and then
You know what that
54.
reminds me of Code Climate, but it's so much better because like Code
Actionable.
Climate, so much of it is like, God, really, like you have to work
Irrelevant.
around. Ugh.
Hey, this line's longer than 80 characters. So you're gonna want to fix that. You're like, whatever, Code Climate.
Like if there, you just like it makes you want to like make a paper mache Code Climate and just beat the living tar out of it sometime. You're like, get out of here, man! Like it's fine.
fun.
Yeah.
Holiday party coming up. I'm just saying. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's like. I mean, we've said it a couple times on this podcast, but Rocket's hiring. We're always hiring. We're always looking for good people. If you think you'd like to work with us, then after listening to this, especially, look us up. Yeah. Hit us up on LinkedIn. Hit us up on whatever
RocketInsights.com.
Rocket
careers
Insights, yeah,
page.
whatever. Yeah. Oh, we have a careers page. Great. I never go to the website anymore. Cool. I mean, I work here. Why would I? So that's it, I think. So until next time when we discuss the heroes who have led us astray, thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah.
Cheers.
Let's ship it. Here we go. Here's that silence we're going to edit out.
Oh, forget it.
Yes.
That's the thing that is plaguing me.